You sit here believing that the pain you carry is somehow accidental, that the tension you feel in certain rooms, in certain relationships, is merely a misunderstanding of temperament or fate. But I will begin by naming what you have already sensed and quietly endured. There are people in your life who say they love you, who speak in the language of care and closeness, yet whose eyes darken when you enter the room, whose warmth cools when you shine without effort, whose affection is threaded with something sharp and unspoken. You feel it as a tightening in your chest, a sudden fatigue after conversations that were outwardly kind, a vague guilt that arrives without cause. You tell yourself you are imagining it. You tell yourself you are too sensitive. But the psyche does not invent pain without reason. When an empath walks through the world responds, and not always with gratitude. You have likely noticed that your presence alone can unsettle certain people. You do not boast, you do not dominate, you do not consciously seek attention, and yet something in you disturbs an invisible balance. You listen deeply, you feel what others avoid feeling. You carry an inner coherence that does not need to announce itself. And this, paradoxically, is what provokes envy in those who claim to love you. Envy, not as a childish wish for what you own, but as a profound psychic disturbance, a reaction to something in you that exposes what they have buried in themselves. This is why the danger is subtle. Open hostility would be easier to name, but envy, disguised as love, seeps into the unconscious, where it can shape destiny. At the level of depth psychology, envy is never about the object. It is about the self that has been disowned. The person who envies you does not want your kindness, your intuition, your emotional attunement in any literal sense. What they envy is that you live in closer proximity to your own soul. You are in contact with layers of feeling they have repressed in order to survive their own history. And when they encounter you, something in their unconscious stirs, something that says, "This was meant to be lived, not buried." That voice is unbearable to hear, so it must be silenced. The easiest way to silence it is not through hatred, but through a corrupted form of love. You must understand that many people build their persona, the social mask, around adaptation rather than authenticity. They learn early which emotions are permitted and which are dangerous. Over time, what is disallowed sinks into the shadow: sensitivity, vulnerability, receptivity, depth of feeling. These are often among the first qualities to be exiled, particularly in cultures or families that reward control, toughness, or performance. When such a person meets you, the empath, your very way of being, activates their shadow. You become a mirror they did not ask for, and mirrors provoke anxiety. Consider what happens unconsciously. The psyche seeks equilibrium. When a repressed quality appears in another person, the unconscious attempts to manage the tension through projection. The envier does not say, "You remind me of what I lost." Instead, they feel an irritation they cannot explain, a subtle resentment, a sense that you are somehow too much or not quite right. Yet, because the persona insists on love, care, and moral superiority, this resentment cannot be owned. So it is expressed indirectly through passive aggression, faint praise, emotional withdrawal, or covert competition. You are kept close, not to be cherished, but to be managed. This is why the title speaks of people who pretend to love you. Pretense is not always conscious deception. Often it is a self-deception, a desperate attempt to preserve a coherent self-image. To admit envy would shatter the persona. To acknowledge that your presence evokes pain would require confronting the shadow. So the psyche chooses a compromise. Love on the surface, envy underneath, and you, because of your empathic nature, sense both layers at once. You feel the contradiction in your body long before you can articulate it with your mind. Let me offer you a first image from the dream world, because the unconscious speaks most clearly in symbols. Imagine a dream in which you are standing in a familiar house, perhaps your childhood home. The rooms are filled with people you know, friends, family, lovers. They smile at you, speak kindly, invite you to sit, but as you move through the house, you notice that mirrors line the walls. In each mirror, your reflection is slightly distorted, sometimes dimmer, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes fractured. You feel uneasy, though no one is openly hostile. Jung would say that such a dream reveals the environment of projection in which you are living. The house is the psychic system of relationships you inhabit. The mirrors are the other's unconscious reflections of you. What you see in them is not yourself, but yourself as filtered through their unresolved complexes. The empath often grows up learning to read these distortions in order to stay safe. You learned early how to soften yourself, how to dim your light so that others would not feel threatened. This adaptation becomes a complex, a pattern that repeats automatically. When envy arises around you, you instinctively take responsibility for it. You become smaller, quieter, more accommodating. You believe, unconsciously, that if you can just love enough, the tension will dissolve. But envy does not dissolve through accommodation. It feeds on it. Here the shadow deepens because you do not want to see yourself as someone who provokes envy. You repress your own anger, your own instinct for separation. You tell yourself that you are above such things, yet what is repressed does not disappear. It turns inward. This is why so many empaths experience unexplained exhaustion, self-doubt, and loss of direction. You are carrying not only your own feelings, but the unlived life of those around you. Their envy enters you as guilt. Their resentment enters you as confusion. Another symbol arises naturally here, the locked door. You may dream of searching for a room, a place of rest, only to find doors that will not open, or keys that do not fit. This is the image of psychic access denied. Your energy is invested outward, maintaining the emotional equilibrium of others, while your own inner chambers remain closed. The people who envy you unconsciously depend on this arrangement. As long as you remain accessible and self-sacrificing, they do not have to face themselves. At this point, you might ask, why me? Why does the empath, in particular, trigger such reactions? The answer lies in the archetypal realm. The empath carries elements of what Jung would call the anima or animus principle relatedness, soulfulness, inner life into the collective space. Archetypes are not personal, they are universal patterns. When you embody an archetype that others have rejected in themselves, You become its living representative, and representatives are always both needed and attacked. The priest, the healer, the seer, these figures are revered and resented in equal measure throughout history. The empath occupies a similar psychic position, often without realizing it. This dynamic becomes especially potent in close relationships, where unconscious material flows freely. Love promises union, but envy fears exposure, so the relationship oscillates between intimacy and withdrawal. You may notice that when you are wounded, confused, or dependent, the other person is warm and supportive. But when you are clear, grounded, and quietly strong, something shifts, their tone changes, their interest wanes. They may even undermine you subtly, questioning your perceptions or diminishing your experiences. This is not accidental. Your wholeness threatens their defenses. If this pattern remains unconscious, its consequences are grave. Over time, you may lose trust in your own perceptions. You may begin to associate your vitality with danger, your authenticity with relational loss. You may choose invisibility as a form of safety. This is how destiny narrows, not through dramatic tragedy, but through countless small betrayals of the self. The empath who does not recognize envy becomes its silent carrier, but the psyche always offers a path of transformation. Envy, like all shadow material, contains energy. The task is not to destroy it, but to withdraw from its projections. This requires a difficult reorientation. You must stop asking, "How can I be more loving?" and begin asking, "What in me refuses to be seen?" This is not a moral shift, but a psychological one. Love without boundaries is not love. It is participation mystique, a fusion that dissolves the self. Let me give you a second dream image. You are walking through a labyrinth at night. The walls are high, the path winding. You hear voices calling your name, familiar voices, pleading, accusing, loving. You feel compelled to follow them, but each turn leads you deeper into confusion. Then, at the center, you find a small fire burning. When you sit beside it, the voices fade. Jung would say that the labyrinth is the relational unconscious, the fire, the self, the organizing center of the psyche. To sit by that fire is to reclaim your energy from the projections of others. This is the beginning of integration. You do not confront envy directly, that would only entangle you further. Instead, you strengthen your connection to your own inner authority. You allow the shadow to speak, not only the shadow of others, but your own, your anger, your desire for separation, your instinct to say, "No, these are not flaws. They are signals." When you honor them, something remarkable happens. The envier either withdraws or transforms. In both cases, the spell is broken. I will end this part here, not with reassurance, but with a question that must remain alive in you as we continue. What would change in your life if you no longer needed to be loved by those who cannot bear to see you whole? When you allow that question to linger within you, what would change if you no longer needed to be loved by those who cannot tolerate your wholeness? You may feel a subtle fear rise, almost like vertigo. This fear is not about loneliness in the ordinary sense. It is the fear of psychic separation, the fear of stepping out of an unconscious contract that once guaranteed belonging at the cost of selfhood. The empath is rarely abandoned without first being trained to abandon themselves. And so the envy you trigger is bound to a deeper archetypal drama, the struggle between individuation and fusion. At the unconscious level, many of those who surround you have not differentiated their ego from the expectations, wounds, and unfinished lives of their parents. Their culture, their early attachments, they survive by adaptation. You, however, threaten this survival strategy simply by existing as you are. Your sensitivity signals that another mode of being is possible, one in which feeling is not weakness, receptivity is not danger, and inner life has value. This possibility is intolerable to the rigid psyche, and so envy arises, not as a conscious wish to harm you, but as an instinctive defense against disintegration. Envy has a peculiar quality. It wants to take without becoming. The envious person wishes to possess the effect you have, your calm, your insight, your emotional resonance, without undergoing the inner work that produced it. When possession fails, envy turns corrosive. It seeks to spoil what it cannot earn. This is why the empath often experiences subtle sabotage. Plans unravel mysteriously, confidence erodes in the presence of certain people, joy feels unsafe. These are not random misfortunes. They are the psychic consequences of remaining too long in fields saturated with unconscious envy. Here, the symbol of the snake becomes relevant. The snake has always represented instinctual wisdom, renewal, and also danger. In many myths, it is both healer and destroyer. Envy is serpentine in this sense. It coils quietly, rarely striking openly. It moves through warmth and proximity. When someone pretends to love you, the snake lies between you, unseen. You feel its presence as tension, as an unnameable discomfort. But you may doubt yourself because the persona smiles. Yet the body does not lie. The psyche registers truth long before the intellect permits it. You may recall moments when your success, your clarity, or even your simple contentment was met not with shared joy, but with silence, with a change of subject, with a faint tightening in the other's expression. These micro-reactions are the language of envy. They reveal a shadow that has not been integrated. And because you are empathic, you feel compelled to compensate. You downplay yourself. You offer reassurance. You become smaller. This is where your own shadow enters the scene. For the empath's shadow often contains power. You were taught implicitly or explicitly that power disrupts connection. So you split it off. You became the listener, the supporter, the one who understands, but what you repressed did not disappear. It waits. It manifests as chronic fatigue, as sudden bursts of anger that surprise you, as fantasies of disappearance or escape. These are signals that the psyche can no longer sustain the imbalance. Jung insisted that individuation requires confrontation with the shadow, not only the shadow we dislike, but the shadow we fear to claim because it contradicts our moral self-image. For you, this may mean admitting that you are not endlessly patient, not infinitely forgiving, not obliged to remain accessible. It may mean recognizing a cold clarity within you that knows when a bond has become parasitic. This clarity is often misinterpreted as cruelty. both by others and by yourself. But in truth, it is discrimination, the psyche's capacity to distinguish what belongs and what does not. Another image arises here, the mirror, but this time cracked. You may dream of looking into a mirror that suddenly fractures, each shard reflecting a different aspect of you. Some reflections are gentle, others fierce, others distant. Such a dream indicates that the unified persona of the good empath is breaking down. This is not a pathology, it is a necessary disintegration. Only when the mirror breaks can the full spectrum of the self be seen, and only then can envy lose its grip. Because envy feeds on one-sidedness. When you integrate your shadow, something shifts in the relational field. You stop offering unconscious compliance. You no longer absorb what does not belong to you. This does not require confrontation or explanation. It is an inner withdrawal of energy. Jung described this as the withdrawal of projections. When you stop carrying the other's shadow, they are forced, often painfully, to encounter it themselves. This is why some people react strongly when you change. They may accuse you of becoming distant, cold, or selfish. In truth, you have simply stopped being the container for their unlived life. At this stage, it is crucial to understand that not all relationships survive individuation. This is not a moral judgment, it is a psychological fact. Bonds formed around mutual unconsciousness cannot easily endure consciousness. The empath who awakens often experiences a period of profound solitude, not because they are unlovable, but because their psyche is recalibrating. This solitude is symbolized in dreams by vast landscapes, deserts, oceans at night, open skies. These images reflect a return to the self, to a larger inner horizon no longer confined by others' projections. The ocean, especially at night, is a powerful symbol here. It represents the collective unconscious, deep, dark, and immense. To stand before it alone is to face both fear and freedom. You may dream of standing on a shore, watching waves move endlessly, feeling small yet strangely at peace. Jung would say that such a dream marks a threshold. You are no longer defined primarily by interpersonal dynamics. You are beginning to relate to life itself, to the deeper currents of meaning and instinct. From this position, envy appears differently. You see it not as a personal attack, but as a symptom of psychic immaturity. This does not make it harmless, but it makes it comprehensible. And comprehension is power. You no longer need to defend or explain yourself. You no longer need to be loved by those who cannot love themselves. Your task becomes fidelity to your own process. This fidelity is not grand or dramatic. It is expressed in small, consistent acts, honoring your fatigue instead of overriding it, trusting your discomfort instead of rationalizing it away, allowing silence to replace over-explanation. Each act withdraws a thread from the old web. Gradually, the structure collapses, not violently, but inevitably. There is a final symbol I want to place before you now, the closed door that becomes a door you choose not to open. Earlier, the locked door represented denial of access to your own inner space. Now, it represents discernment. You are not obligated to open every door, to respond to every knock, The psyche matures when it learns that boundaries are not defenses against love, but conditions for it. As we move forward, the question deepens. If envy no longer defines your relationships, if pretense no longer binds you, what kind of connection becomes possible? And more unsettling still, who are you when you are no longer needed in the old way? These are not questions to be answered quickly. They are questions that must be lived. When you begin to live those questions rather than answer them, you may notice a strange reversal. What once felt like strength in others now appears brittle, and what once felt like your own weakness begins to reveal itself as depth. This is not a flattering realization. It is sobering, for the empath's journey is not toward superiority, but toward clarity, and clarity can be lonely before it becomes liberating. As you step out of the old dynamic, you may witness something unsettling. The envy that was once disguised as affection may surface more openly, or it may turn into indifference. Both are expressions of the same psychic truth. When you no longer carry what is not yours, the other person must confront the emptiness or fragmentation within themselves. Some will turn away rather than face it. Others will attempt to pull you back into the old role, appealing to guilt, nostalgia, or moral obligation. This is the last defense of the complex. A complex, as Jung understood it, is an emotionally charged cluster of ideas that operates autonomously. The empath is often caught in other people's complexes, particularly family and relational ones, because their sensitivity makes them a natural carrier. But complexes lose power when they are named and observed. When you see the pattern clearly, you are no longer possessed by it. You may still feel its pull, but you are not compelled to obey. At this stage, dreams often change in tone. The labyrinth may reappear, but now you move through it with greater awareness. You may dream of finding exits, of walking above the maze, or of realizing that the walls are lower than you thought. Such dreams signal a shift in perspective. The psyche is no longer trapped in repetition. It is experimenting with freedom. Another dream may come. You are in a room with someone you love, or once loved. They are speaking, but their words do not reach you. It is as if a transparent wall stands between you. You feel sadness, but also relief. This dream reflects the emergence of psychological boundaries. You can see and feel the other, but you are no longer fused. Communication does not require absorption. This is where the anima or animus dynamic deepens. In many who envy you, the inner opposite the anima in men. The animus in women remains underdeveloped or distorted. Your presence activates it. You embody a relatedness they have not integrated. Instead of engaging that inner figure, they project it onto you. They want you to carry their soul for them. When you withdraw, they feel abandoned, even betrayed. Though nothing conscious has been taken away, what they mourn is not you, but the loss of access to their own inner life. For you, the task is different. You must reclaim your own anima or animus energy from the role of caretaker. This energy is creative, intuitive, eros-driven. When it is no longer consumed by maintaining relational equilibrium, it seeks expression elsewhere. You may feel drawn to new forms of work, art, study, or solitude. This is not escapism, it is reorientation. The libido, the psychic energy, returns to its rightful center. Here, the symbol of fire becomes central. Earlier, the fire at the center of the labyrinth offered stillness. Now, fire represents transformation. You may dream of tending a flame, of watching something burn without fear, or of carrying a torch through darkness. Fire consumes, but it also illuminates. It demands respect. When you honor your own fire, envy loses its leverage, because envy thrives only where vitality is disowned. There is often a period of mourning here. You grieve not only lost relationships, but the image of yourself as endlessly available, endlessly forgiving. You may feel guilt for no longer playing that role, but guilt, in this context, is the echo of an outdated moral framework. It belongs to a time when survival depended on appeasement. You are no longer there. The psyche is asking you to update its values. Jung warned that individuation is often mistaken for selfishness by those who remain unconscious. This misunderstanding can wound the empath deeply. You may feel misunderstood, judged, or mischaracterized, but this, too, is part of the process. When you stop living as a projection screen, people must relate to you as a separate being. Not everyone is capable of that. This realization is painful, but it is also clarifying. Gradually, something stabilizes within you. You no longer scan rooms for emotional shifts. You no longer feel responsible for moods that are not yours. You may still sense them. Empathy does not disappear, but you are not compelled to act on them. This is the difference between empathy and enmeshment. The former is a capacity, the latter is a wound. At this point, relationships that are rooted in mutual recognition begin to feel possible. They are quieter, less dramatic. There is less intensity, but more truth. Envy may still arise, because it is a human emotion, but it is no longer disguised as love. It is either acknowledged and worked through, or it dissolves through mutual respect. Such relationships are rare, but they are real. I want to return briefly to the image of the sea. Earlier, you stood alone at its edge. Now, imagine entering the water willingly, not to drown, but to swim. You feel the cold, the resistance, the vastness. You are not separate from the ocean, yet you are not consumed by it. This is the mature relationship to the collective unconscious. Participation without loss of self. From this place, you can look back on the old patterns without bitterness. You see that envy was never about you in the personal sense. It was about the psychic tension your presence created. You were a catalyst, and catalysts are rarely thanked by the processes they initiate. But without them, transformation would not occur. As we approach the final movement of this lecture, the question shifts once more. If your empathy is no longer a liability, if your sensitivity no longer binds you to those who resent it, what is it now for? What does the psyche ask of an empath who has integrated their shadow and withdrawn from false love? This is not an abstract question. It is the threshold of a new responsibility, one that does not involve sacrifice, but conscious choice. When the psyche poses that question, what is your empathy now for? It is no longer asking you to give more, it is asking you to stand differently. This is the final reversal that confuses many empaths, the realization that empathy once integrated, is not primarily relational. It is existential. It is a way of perceiving reality without dissolving into it. You may notice that you are no longer compelled to rescue, explain, or soothe, not because you have hardened, but because something in you has settled into its own center. Jung would call this alignment with the self, not the ego's idea of who you should be, but the deeper organizing principle that gives your life coherence. When you are aligned there, envy loses its final foothold, for envy requires comparison, and the self does not compare, it simply is. At this stage, encounters with envy feel different. You may recognize it immediately. Without shock or self-blame, you feel no urge to correct it or absorb it. You understand its origin, and that understanding creates distance. This distance is not coldness, it is perspective. You no longer mistake another person's discomfort for a problem you must solve. You allow them their psychic task, just as you have taken responsibility for yours. There is often one last symbolic dream that marks this integration. You may dream of standing before a door that is now unlocked. On the other side is light, or an open landscape, or simply an empty room filled with air. You open the door not with urgency, but with calm. Nothing dramatic happens, and that is the point. The psyche signals that access to the inner world is now voluntary, not coerced by fear or obligation. You are no longer trapped outside yourself. This is the reframe that changes everything. Your sensitivity was never meant to make you agreeable. It was meant to make you conscious. Consciousness is disruptive. It unsettles systems built on repression. It exposes false harmony. That is why you triggered envy. You were never the cause of it. You were the occasion for its appearance. And once you see that, you stop carrying shame for reactions that do not belong to you. From here, your relationships reorganize naturally. Some fade without drama. Others deepen slowly, cautiously, built on mutual recognition rather than need. You are no longer chosen for your availability, but for your presence. This distinction is subtle but decisive. Availability can be exploited, presence cannot. Presence requires that the other person also be present to themselves. You may still feel moments of sadness when you recall how much energy you once gave away, how much of yourself you abandoned to keep others comfortable. But this sadness is clean. It does not entangle you. It informs you. It becomes wisdom rather than wound. Jung insisted that what is made conscious does not disappear, it transforms. Your past suffering becomes orientation, not burden. And now, the final truth must be spoken plainly. The empath who integrates their shadow does not become harmless, they become clear. Clarity is threatening to those who live by pretense. It always has been. But clarity is also liberating to you and to those who are ready to meet it. You no longer need to dim yourself to be loved. You no longer need to be needed to belong. You no longer confuse endurance with virtue. So when you encounter envy now, and you will, because the world is not suddenly healed, you recognize it as a signpost rather than a sentence. It tells you where not to linger. It tells you where consciousness has reached its limit, and instead of shrinking, you stand still. You do not argue. You do not justify. You simply remain aligned with what is true for you. This is the quiet authority that emerges at the end of the empath's long initiation. Not dominance, not withdrawal, but a grounded presence that no longer negotiates its own reality. From this place, love is no longer a performance or a sacrifice. It is a meeting rare, reciprocal, and real. And if there is a final call to awareness I would leave you with, it is this: your empathy was never meant to keep you powerless. It was meant to lead you home to yourself. When you stop mistaking envy for love, you stop mistaking self-erasure for goodness. And in that moment, quiet, unannounced, irreversible, you step out of the old fate and into a life that no longer feeds on your disappearance.